Okay, good afternoon. This rainy Thursday. A few things just from last time. Chris very kindly did a little background on the cellist whose picture I showed you in the ruins of Sarajevo last time, and I just leave this for you to read. Second thing I want to say is that all the next Mondays are fine for me for the coffee now at 2 o'clock upstairs. So that'll be our regular new time. I don't have any other meetings, so I hope to see some of you who I haven't seen on the Thursdays or the odd Monday slots then. Next week, we have no reading assigned for the first of the two lectures, which is on issues of criminal justice and human rights. But I'm going to send you 4 pages of a piece by our, I know everyone's enthusiastic about that, only 4 pages, I promise you, by our speaker, or our visitor, a man named Jonathan Simon, who is a lawyer and a sociologist who is an expert on criminal justice issues, and he's going to speak to us on a subject different than he spoke to the class when I did it before. He's going to speak not on capital punishment, which had been an earlier interest, though he could certainly answer questions on that. He's going to speak to you about this recent Supreme Court decision called the Brown decision, which dealt with California prisons and which raised the issue of human dignity as a criteria for adjudicating lawsuits against the prison system. So it puts the American penology squarely in the realm of human rights. So I think that'll be an interesting and timely topic. So if you would just read the 4 pages that he published in the Criminology Journal, and it should be up for you very soon. And then on Thursday, we have a split session. The human rights librarian is going to come and speak to you. And I think I've talked to several of you and passed on some of the things I've learned from him, but it'll be useful for all of you, sort of how to navigate your way through sources, and he'll be good contact for you. I mean, when we talked to Coffee last time, most of the people at Coffee at that time confessed to not having ever been in the library. And there's a technique of research which they did in the old days, which is asking someone rather than Googling him. And sometimes asking someone is more precise than Googling, because the algorithm in the human brain can sort of focus a little better. So I'm hoping I bring you the librarian, and it will encourage you to both see librarians who are scholars of their own right, and to talk to other people about how to get to answering a problem, rather than having your first resort be Google, which is fine, but not the only way to go. So I think that is all I want to tell you before I start the lecture for the day. And the lecture for today is on the corpus delicti and the names of the dead. So really what I want to the subject today is the dead in human rights. Let me begin with the first issue, the corpus delicti. The corpus delicti means literally, it's from Latin, the body of a crime. It's that which upon which the crime was visited, and which is in itself the evidence for the perpetration of the act. Now, in some ways, you're, I think, familiar with the notion of the corpus delicti, even if you haven't thought of it as that, because we began, when we talked about humanitarian narratives and slave bodies, the notion that you could see visited on the bodies of slaves the evil of slavery. That is to say, the pictures of slaves with their lacerated backs. So you could draw the conclusion from the scars on the person's back that they'd been treated in a way which was criminal from the perspective of the person who presented that picture. Likewise, the fact that slaves were thrown overboard was in itself evidence of the abuse of slave bodies, which speaks to that crime. So, in some sense, we've talked about the corpus delicti in that way. We also talked about the corpus delicti without naming it in the context of this large body of photographic evidence that we've been considering since the beginning of photographs in the 19th century of starving bodies and of mutilated bodies from the Bulgarian atrocities, the Armenian massacres, and other. We could have done many more, Chinese foot binding. I mean, a whole bunch of these photographic evidence of what's taken to be, from the perspective of the person presenting it, criminal acts whose evidence is written on the body. So, and we've shown you some of that evidence. But just to be more specific now for a moment, the 19th century saw a gigantic expansion of forensic science and forensic medicine, which made the body much more, linked the body much closer to the commission of the investigation of the commissions of crimes. So, very big expansions in knowledge of chemistry and chemical analysis, so you could tell us someone were poisoned. The development of autopsy techniques, so you could tell a great deal about the body in a very specific way about how it died. You could from the body, from the young body to the old body. One of the very first techniques in forensic medicine develops in the context of infanticide prosecutions, where the question arises, was this child stillborn or did the mother kill the child? And it was in the late 18th century that physicians came up with this test about whether the lungs flowed. If the child were born alive, he would have breathed and the lungs would have been expanded. If the child were stillborn, it would not have been. Real criminal issues of criminal jurisprudence are involved in this test. So beginning in the late 18th century and very much in the 19th century, there's a great expansion of forensic medicine. It's linked on the one hand with the police and the expansion of police forces, but it's linked on the other hand also to reform and some of the human rights discussions that we've been talking about. That is to say, how can you tell that is actually some human rights offenses going on in the treatment of children in factories? How can you tell that there has been mass rape? All these things that we talk about. The reason you can tell is that you can investigate the bodies upon which this was done. So the two parts then. There's forensics. There's three parts. There's corpus delicti as sort of having been central all along to human rights. There's a development of forensic medicine which makes us much more able to analyze the body in relation to what happened to it, and then I suggested that it has two aspects. One, actually part of criminal investigation, which carries over into criminal human rights investigations, right? And on the one hand, and the reform and efforts to make something better. So in other words, the criminal investigations that we had a lecture on are based on, in some sense, these kind of forensic investigations. How do we know that a Yugoslav general actually ordered the killing of these guys? Well, we know by examining the bodies. So many of these criminal prosecutions of human rights offenses are in kind like the criminal prosecutions of the 19th century, only much larger and with a new criminal jurisprudence. Is that sort of okay so far? So that's the first things I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about today is the issue of naming the dead. This is actually, I think it develops in the 19th century in various contexts I'm going to talk to you about. And in the 20th century, the idea of actually finding out the names of people whose rights have been violated is a really important and widespread and much engaged with human rights activity. By that I mean when the forensic investigations are done in the former Yugoslavia, or in El Salvador, or in Peru, or in Argentina, or Rwanda, or in Cambodia, as you'll see. The issues are not simply finding out how these people died, that a crime was committed. You would know a crime was committed without knowing who the people were. But a great deal of effort is going into actually finding out who were these people, naming them, trying to find a picture of them. In other words, somehow reanimating these dead through connecting a dead body with a name, and if even possible with a face, and if possible even with a family to whom that name or that face means something. So a lot of, as you'll see, human rights activity it focuses on that. So the story I'm going to tell you about today in general is the story of bones and human rights, and the story of attaching names to bones and human rights. Now, all of the story I'm telling you is, of course, a retrospective story. These people are dead. So the kinds of activities I'm talking about that isn't going to prevent anything. Isn't going to prevent the crime that's being investigated. What it does is two things, or three things really. Number one, as I already mentioned, it's relevant to criminal prosecution, and therefore the making right through law that we had several lectures about. Second, it's relevant to the issue of reconciliation and remaking, which we pointed out is often in tension with the issue of criminal prosecution, or it's almost always in criminal prosecution. And the third thing it's meant to do is, of course, never again. It's meant to be a stand as a warning to what was done, and therefore is meant to, or is hoped to, prevent these kinds of things from happening again. Right? So the human rights in bones is to do with the prosecution part, which we talked about, with the reconciliation part, remaking part, which we talked about, and with the issue of preventing a future one. It's not, like many of the things we've talked about, an effort to stop something happening prospectively. So is this okay so far? You guys have not been so good in interrupting me every 20 minutes, which I learned is the best practice. Do you know that 20 minutes is about as long as you can listen? I can't do it that long, but you seem to be doing pretty well, I think. Okay, so let's look first at the issue of naming. I'm going to do this in reverse order. First at the issue of naming, and then at the corpus delicti and its investigation. Well, in some sense, the name has been and is in most cultures a sign of a person and a memorial mark. So I quote you here from Isaiah, and to them will I give in my house and within my walls memorial and a name. The memorial to the Holocaust in Israel is Yad Vashem, which is the place of names, connects to the memorial as a naming place that shall not be cut off. That is to say, the name shall be connected to the person. So that's in the sort of Western Judeo-Christian tradition, but clearly other traditions have this notion of names as connecting to the memorial lines. That is to say, even very poor Chinese households traditionally have had small altars in which the names of ancestors are written and recorded. And one is in the presence of the ancestors, when one's in the presence of the name. So the notion of names and connected to people, and names as some way of keeping the dead amongst the living, is a very old tradition, and I think it exists in most cultures in one fashion or the other. So that's not a modern. That's not a modern story. But what isn't modern is the remembering of names in specific